Baruch Hashem. Today's daf yomi is Menachos daf Chav Daled, and we're going to start on the bottom of Chav Gimel Amud Beis. 3 lines after the lines begin to get wide. Gemara said in yesterday's daf yomi that there's a dispute between Rav Chisda and Rebbe Chanina about whether or not we say that we follow the mevatel or the one that is misbatel, the one that is becoming nullified, or the one that is doing the nullifying. Rabbi Chanina says we follow the one that's being nullified, and Rav Chisda says we follow the one that's doing the nullification. So now the Gemara brought 3 proofs yesterday, and now the Gemara brings a 4th and final proof. So we say Tishma Tivwa Beketzach. Let's say you spice up the matzah with ketzach, a type of seed, or shumshamin, or sesame seed, or bekolmine tavlin, or other types of seeds. Kshera, it's kshera. Why is it kosher? Matzahi, because it's matzah. Shenikres matzah mituvelis, but it's called spicy matzah. So the assumption of the Gemara says the assumption is the apishla tavlin tfemi matzah, that there's more in any one area. There might be more spices than the matzah, and yet still we're saying that it is not nullifying it. Now, Bishlam Amandamar Basar Bato Azlina, and it makes sense going to one who says that we follow the one who's doing the nullifying. Then we're going to say Bato Havi Kamivato, that the one who's doing the nullifying, i.e., the spices, can eventually Bato Have Kamivato, and the one that's doing the nullification, the one that's being nullified, can be, it makes sense according to Rabbi Chanina. It says we follow the one that's being nullified, because the one that's being nullified, i.e. the matzah, can eventually become like the seeds. Because when it becomes moldy, have like a tavlin, it's no longer matzah, and it's like spices. And so therefore we're going to say that they don't nullify each other. It's min b'mino. And so therefore that's why he's saying it's not nullifying it. So but according to Rav Chisda, says we follow the one that's doing the nullifying. The spices can never become matzah, and so therefore the spices should nullify the matzah. So the Gemara says, no, the scenario was wrong. It's not that the spices were the majority. The ruba matzi, the majority is the matzah, and therefore the spices just are not the majority over it. And they kanami, the katani matzi, it's matzah, nikres matzah mituvelis. It's called matzah that's spicy matzah, but it's basically matzah, and so therefore it's not relevant to our case. Shmamina. Kisal Rav Kahana, when Rav Kahana went from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael, Ashkechinu of Nei Rebbe Chia, found the children of Rebbe Chia who sat and they asked him 3 questions. The Yasvi V'Ka'amri, and they sat and they asked him 3 questions. First question was Isaro, and let's say you have the flour, 1 mincha is shechilek, that you divide it into 2. You have an isaron of flour, and you divide it into 2. Ve'nichu bebisa, and you put it into the bowl, the klisheres, that which you would mix the mincha. But the 2 halves were not touching each other. V'nagat full yom, and a person who was tamei, and he had gone to the mikvah, and he was waiting for nightfall to be tahor. So this person touched echamei, and he touched one of the sides. Mahu. What would be the halacha about the other side? Is the other side of the mincha that's not touching going to become, that he didn't touch? Is that tamei? Kitinan, when we learned in the Mishnah in Psachim and Chagiga, the Mishnah and Chagiga, that we learned Kli Mitzarev Masha B'Sochol Kadesh, that a utensil can combine everything that's in it to sanctify it. Hani Mili Hechi Denagi Ba'adadi. Is that only where they're touching each other? Avo Hechi Denagi Ba'adadi, but where they're not touching each other, then they can combine. Whoa. Odoma Wolishna, or maybe we don't say that. Meaning to say, are we going to combine the 2 halves even though they're not touching? So Amar Lahu, so Rav Kahana responds, Eo meet Amalahu Eo, he responded to them, Mitanan Kli Machaber. It doesn't say the Kli joins together, that's if they're touching. Kli Mitzaref, it combines them, meaning if they're not touching. Kli Mitzaref Tanan. So, Koldu. So, even if they're not touching, it combines them. So now we have the next question that they asked him. Hoshid Echad L'Beinehen, that let's say he stuck and we're on top of 24a. He stuck another mincha in between the other menachos. So there were two halves, and he stuck a third half in between them. So and then he touched that third part. So now, so now So this middle one became tamei, and we want to know if the two other parts become tamei. Amrullah said to them, so in the first case, it became tamei even though it wasn't touching, but there the two parts were both needed for the utensil. But this one, it doesn't need the utensil. If it needs the utensil, kli mitzarfo. And so if it needs the kli, if it needs the utensil, then it combines them. But ain't sarach but if it doesn't need the utensil like this other half, then we're going to say in the kli mitzarfo. Then the utensil does not combine them. And so therefore, in that case, the other two parts do not become tamei. Now let's say the third question that Bnei Rebbe Chia on the top of 24a asked Rav Kahana. Let's say he just stuck his finger in between in the airspace of the utensil where they were. Would we say that that finger will combine to make the mincha, the two parts of the mincha tamei, even though it's not touching? They responded, no. No, that's not going to become tamei because the only thing that makes something tamei in the airspace is if it would be a pottery utensil, and since the bisa is not a kli cheres, it wouldn't. This utensil that they mixed the mincha in was not a pottery utensil. Therefore, it's not going to become tamei. Then, after they asked him those three questions, he turned around and asked them questions. He turned around and asked them a question. Malik motz mizeh al zeh. Can you take the kamitza from the, again, we have the utensil, which has two parts in it, and they're not touching each other. And can you do a kamitza from one part on the kamitza of the other part? That just like we say that the utensil combines them to make one part tamei, even though it's not touching, can it also combine to allow you to do a kamitza or not? Do we say tziruf d'oraisa? The fact that the utensil combines is biblical concept. Then it doesn't matter whether it's to be strict to say it's one utensil to make them tamei, or even to be lenient to say you could do a kamitza even though they're not all connected. Oh, the Rabbanan, or do we say it's Rabbanan, that it's Rabbanan who said it's one utensil to combine them to be strict but not to be lenient? Amru lo, so they responded, Bnei Rebbe Chia said, Zulo Shamana. We didn't actually hear this exact case, but Kayotze Bo Shamana, but we heard a similar case. The Tanan, Shtei Menachos, let's say you have two Menachos, Shalom Nikmitzu, they never had a Kamitza from them, V'nis Arvazu Bazu, and then this was our Mishnah, which is why we're talking about it, and they became mixed together. If you have enough, if you could take a kamitza from each one on their own, sheros, then it's going to be kosher. Psuos, but otherwise it's disqualified. But if you could do the kamitza, then it's kosher. But amai, the parts. But why can you do a kamitza? The part of the mincha that's mixed with the second mincha is not going to be touching its komats, meaning to say that the part of it's mixed together, and so therefore it's not connected to its komets, and so therefore we're not going. It's going to. How can you say? Because we assume that the middle part is connected and the parts at the end are not connected. That's why you do the kamitza, and so therefore the part that you're doing the kamitza on is not touching the part that it's covering with its kamitza, and so therefore we see from here that even though you could do the kamitza even though it's not touching it. Amarava, no. What are you talking about? Dilma begushin, amachulakin asuin kamasrei. Maybe it's like talking about a case where it's not that there was another part that's totally distinct, but it's like a comb or a fork where there was one base and then the different prongs went up. So it's possible that it was touching it, even though it was a distinct part. So that's So you don't have an answer there. So my havi, so what's the answer? Amarava, Tashma, the Tanya vehera mimenu. So it says in the pasuk they rimi you take from it a kometz from what's connected that you can't bring an isron and two utensils and do a kamitza v'yikmotz. But doesn't that imply a bekli echad dumya d'shnei kelim kometz that if it will be one utensil similar to two utensils and that it's not touching, you could do the kamitza. So Rabbah tries to say you can do the kamitza even though the kamitza is not touching part of the flour as long as they're in the same utensil. Mar says Abai rejects it. Abai Dilma Shnei Kelim Hechidami. Maybe what is the two utensils? You go gafiza bekava. Maybe it's talking about a case where there's a kafiza, which is a utensil that holds less, is in a kav, which is a utensil that holds more. But the kafiza, the small utensil, is going to be actually taller than the larger utensil. The afagav the ariva meiloi, that even though the part of the min part are connected above, by the heaping part of the utensil, given the mivsach mechitzasa the kafiza mitata lo, since there's a space on the bottom that separates them, it's not going to work. But if it would be hakliyacha dumya dishnei kelim, but if it be one utensil similar to two utensils, and what would that be? One utensil where it's like utensils, where it's like two utensils, that it would work. It could go now. Riva's starting to go in. Like you have a trough to feed the chicken, and so therefore one part is put in the utensil where you put the food, and then there's a partition in between that's smaller to separate the place of the water from the place of the chicken feed, and that part doesn't reach the trough on above. Even though there's that when it's placed in the utensil, hanagia, nevertheless, they touch above in the airspace of the utensil, and so therefore it's going to be considered like it's connected. But here, where they don't touch at all, then tibayalach. Meaning to say, if they touch on the top, that's going to be a question, but that's going to be okay. But if they don't touch at all, then it's not a question. And so therefore, that's what they basically said. So by Rabbi Yirmiyah, so now our friend Rabbi Yirmiyah comes along and says, so let's say, what's the situation? You have half an isaron that became tamei through they're both in the same utensil. You put two isarons of flour in one utensil, and they're not touching each other. But because they're in the same utensil, we already established that they're tamei. But now the tuma touched one of the halves, and outside of the utensil, there's another half of an isaron which is connected to the part that wasn't directly touched through water. And so therefore the question is, Mao, do we say the half of isaron that's in the utensil is that wasn't directly touched, but it was tummy from the utensil, is able to transmit tumah through the connection of the water? When it says that the utensil makes whatever's in it sacred or tamei, that's whatever's in it, but not to be able to say that what's outside of it is also tamei. No, maybe it has the same principles of whatever directly was touched. And if you want to say whatever's connected is connected, well, let's look at it the opposite way. Let's say the water is what touches the utensil, meaning to say that half a isaron of flour that was outside, and that became and that was attached to a half of an isaron through water in the utensil. And the part that became directly tamei was the part that's outside. So now it touches through water half of what's in the isaron, and now the other part is it going to become tamei. When we say the utensil combines, maybe that's only if it's touched inside. But what's touched outside, it doesn't combine. Maybe there's no distinction. Okay, so now up to the next question. By Rava. Rava asked the following question. Isaron shechilko. So let's say you have these two flours, that they were divided. V'nitma achamei, and one of them became tamei. V'inichu babisa, you put it in the mixing utensil. V'chazar tful yom v'naga ba'uso tamei. And now, after it was already tamei, a tful yom came and touched it. Mao, do we say mi amrinon savalo tuma? Do we say, meaning to say that the tful yom can? When do we say that utensil combines? Tuma, when the Tvul Yom touched one of them when it was already in. But if you placed it in it before when it was already Tamei, then it wouldn't combine. But in this case, he placed it, but it had already been Tamei. When he touched it, when the Tvul Yom touched the Mincha and made it Tamei, it was already Tamei. So do we say, Davalo Tuma, that it already was saturated with Tuma and it can't become Tamei again? Sounds a little bit like the concept of a prohibition cannot fall upon another prohibition. It's not the exact same thing, but it's similar like that. So do we say it cannot become tamei again from the Tvul Yom to make the other part tamei? Oh, or do we not say that? Abaye says, "Me amrina and savoi tuma." Do we really say this concept that once it's saturated with tuma, it can't become tamei again? Now let's bring a case. Let's bring a question from the case of tumei midras, which is that if somebody who's a zav lies on a sheet, he makes it tamei and avatuma. But then if you take that sheet and you take it from being like a bed, but you turn it into like a hanging sheet, which is not something to lie upon, then it becomes what's called the first degree tumah only through touching. So that's the case from the Mishnah in Kelim Vatanan Sadin Tameh Midrash. Let's say you had a sheet that was Tameh from Midrash or on top of 24b from lying down. Vasu Vilon. And then you said, you know what, I'm going to make it a curtain. So then we're going to say Tarmina Midrash. It's no longer Tumas Midrash, the Ava Tuma, but Avatame Maga Midrash, but it's Tame from touching, meaning its Tuma went down because you touched it. And Amar Rabbi Yossi, and Rabbi Yossi says, Be'ezeh Midrash Nagaza. He says, what are you talking about? Nobody touched it. You turned into a sheep, but he didn't touch it after you turned into a sheep. Only if the Zav touched it, does it become what's called a Rishon Tameh, which is what the Zav touches it. But Kinagabo Azav Miyatame. So also Rabbi Yossi admits that if the Zav touches it, it becomes Tameh, Vafilu B'sof. And even if he touch it afterwards, meaning after he lay down on it, Vamai, why can he turn around after it when it's already a primary degree of Tumah, an avatuma, and now touch it and make it a first degree of tumah? Why wouldn't we say savlei tumah? So doesn't that prove we don't say this concept of savlei tumah? So Ingmar says that's not a proof. How do we know that if the zav touched it, it was after he laid down? Maybe it had already been a rishon tumah prior to him laying down on it, and that's okay for it to go from a rishon to an av. So maybe it's a different scenario. You would assume that the Zav touched it after he laid down on it, or maybe he touched it before. Maybe it was before he laid down on it, that it was a more severe tumah than now that he laid down on it on the lighter tumah. But in this case, where they're both lesser degrees of tumah, in the case of the mincha, maybe we wouldn't say that. Elami Sefer, the Gemara says, maybe from the final clause, Moda Rabbi Yossi. So what does the Sefer say? The Rabbi Yossi admits in a case, well, it's not really the end of that Mishnah, but we call it the Sefer the Mishnah. So Tosfos says it's a brisa. So anyway, Moda Rabbi Yossi would admit, B'shnei Sidan Hamilkupolen Umenachon Zelzev Yashav Zeh Avale. And let's say there are two sheets that are folded and placed upon each other, and the Zav sat on them. She'alyon Tami Midros, Vatachton Tami Midros. That both the top one is Tami Midros, and the bottom one is Tamei Midrash because he sat on it. And also the top one is Maga Midrash. The top one, since he also touched it, is what's called Maga Midrash, the Rishon Tumah. V'amai, but why? Lema Savlei Tumah. How could it become both? How could it become the Avatuma and the Rishon Tumah? Doesn't this prove that we do say that we don't say this concept of Savlei Tumah because it's both Avatuma and a Rishon Tumah? The Gemara says, no, it's a totally different case. In the case of the sheets in the Tamei Zav, that's where they had happened at the exact same time. So therefore, we allow the properties to happen. Even say that also by Isser Chal Isser. If they happen at the same time, we don't say the concept of one prohibition can apply on the other one. But in the case of the Mincha B'zeh, And so they one after the other. So we have not answered Rava's question. Now the Gemara goes to an Isaron where you lose half of it, and you separate in its place another Isaron to another half of the Isaron, and then you find it. So really what you're supposed to do at that point is take out a half of the Isaron that you found and just bring the regular mincha. But he didn't do that. So what's the law? Amarava Isaron shechelko. Let's say you have this Isaron that you divide into two halves. Va'avad achad man, and then you lost a half. V'hifresh achar tachtav, and you brought in the new part, and you put it into the utensil, and afterwards v'nimtza rishon, and then you found the first one. Now you weren't going correctly now, and now there are all three there in the same utensil. V'nimtza avod, and then the nitma avod, then the one that was lost became tamei. So we're going to say under those circumstances, and they're all in the utensil, Avid Varishon Mitzdarfen, that the first one and the one that was lost, i.e. the original two, they become Tamei. And so therefore, it makes the one that was found makes the initial one Tamei, a Mufrash, but the new one a Mitzdarf. But the new one does not become Tamei because when he separated it, the new one, his intent was never to bring it with the one that was lost. And so now that the lost one becomes Tamei, we're not going to say he combines it through the tzir of clay. But if it was Nitma Mufrash, if the one that was the newly designated one became Tamei, Mufrash for Rishon Mitzdarf, and the first and the new one become Tamei because they were intended to be together. But the Avod Mitzdarf, but the one that was lost, which was never intended to be with the new one, does not combine. Nitma Rishon, but if the initial one became Tamei in the utensil, Shnei Mitzdarfim, because then they all combine because they were all intended to be with the initial one. Amar Abaye, I feel Nitma Echad Man, Nami Shnei Mitzdarfim. Abaye says all three always become Tamei. My time of Kul B'nei Bikta all of them are living in the same house, meaning to say they all came because of the first mincha, and so therefore they're all going to combine for tzir of kli. And we say the same thing with respect to kamitza. We say kamatz mina avod. Now let's say you do a kamitza from the one that was lost. Shiar v'rishon nechal, and then you can eat the shirayim from the first one and the one that was lost. But mufrash and nechal, same concept. Well, the new one you can't eat from it. Kamatz mina mufrash. You did the kamitza from the new one. Shiar v'rishon nechal, and you could eat the shirayim from the first one and the new one. Avod enonecha, we can't eat the kamitza from the lost one because it was never intended to be with the mufrash. And so too, kamatz arishon shneim enonecha. But if you did the kamitza from the first one, now it's the opposite ruling because now in this case, all of them cannot be eaten because they're both appropriate to combine with the first one. And since you can't have both of them combined because the kometz can only allow one isaron, so therefore the only one that will be allowed is the first Isharon, which you took the kometz from. And one of the other halves, and we don't know which one, and so therefore both of them cannot be eaten. Only the first kamitza can be eaten. Bayamar, do kometz me'achaman shnein in a nechon. Even if you do kamitza from any one of them, you cannot eat from the other two. My time. All of them are from the same one, and so therefore he applied the same logic. But what? How can you eat the shirayim from that kometz? But he could danka the kometz will carve. But isn't it possible that there's a sixth of the kometz that's missing that was not brought? Meaning to say, there's 1/6 of the kometz that's missing for each half of the isaron of the mincha, because the kohen who does the kometz for the 3 halves of the isaron, and so therefore, for each one, he's doing 1/3 of the kometz. And so since the mincha only has one isaron, it's clear that 1/3 of the kamitza is basically useless. And so therefore, when he divides it up, it's going to be missing 1/3 of the kometz. So Rav Yitzchak prayed to Rav Mesharsha, the kometz kufei yechakarv. How can the kometz itself be brought? He could tell Tachulin, 1/3 of it is not good. So Rav Ashi, kometz bedata the kohen talia milsa. The kohen can kometz a isaron can kometz. No, the kohen, that it's not a question. Now we can answer. The kometz is dependent upon the intent of the Kohen, and the Kohen has intent just for the Isaron and not before the additional two halves. And so therefore the kometz is not missing anything. And also the shirayim of the first half could be eaten just like every shirayim of the mincha. So he answers both questions. So Rav Ashi answers both the question of Rav Papa and Rav Yitzchak Parei to Rav Mashasha. It depends on the intent of the Kohen. Okay, this is today's daf. Baruch Hashem. We'll stop here, and again we'll repeat it after davening. Shkoyach.